The wind, a wolf with frosted breath, tore at Eliza's threadbare shawl, threatening to rip the last vestiges of warmth from her bones. Each step was a battle against the drifts that had swallowed the faint trail, against the crushing weight of snow that piled on her shoulders, against the despair that had settled deep in her marrow. Silas was gone, swallowed by the river 2 days north, leaving her stranded, a widow orphaned by circumstance in a land as unforgiving as the empty promises he'd always whispered. She tried to follow the river south, believing it would lead her to the nearest settlement. But the storm had risen with a sudden, malicious fury, blinding her, disorienting her. Now only instinct, a raw, primal will to survive, pushed her forward. Her fingers were numb, her lips cracked, her stomach a hollow ache that gnawed at her consciousness. The light, when it flickered through the swirling white, seemed a hallucination, a cruel trick of the failing day. Yet it persisted, a distant, yellow beacon against the encroaching slate gray of the sky. The cabin. It had to be. With a final, desperate surge of will, Eliza stumbled towards it, her legs feeling like crumbling columns of ice. The smell of wood smoke, faint but distinct, reached her, a promise of warmth that fueled her last reserves. She collapsed a few yards from the crude log structure, her body shuddering uncontrollably, the cold of venom seeping into her core. The cabin door creaked open, and a tall, silhouetted figure emerged, blocking the light. He was large, his presence a dark, imposing mass against the snow-filled twilight. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of her exhaustion. Every tale of solitary men in the wild, of travelers vanishing without a trace, screamed through her mind. But she had nothing left to lose, no energy to flee. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, raw with desperation and the last spark of a desperate hope. Are you the rancher who saves lost girls?" she choked out, the words catching in her throat, laced with a plea she couldn't quite articulate. The man stood motionless, a silent, unreadable sentinel. His face was shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat, his features obscured by the falling snow and the fading light. A long moment stretched, filled only by the howl of the wind and the frantic hammering of her own heart. Then, his voice, rough and deep, cut through the din, devoid of warmth or pity. "No," he said, his words stark against the desolation. "I'm the one kidnapping them." The confession hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement. Eliza's breath hitched. A fresh wave of terror threatened to consume her. But then, surprisingly, it didn't. Her body was too spent, her mind too numb. There was a strange, blunt honesty in his tone, a lack of theatrical menace that somehow, incongruously, settled something in her. He took a step closer, his boots crunching softly on the snow. She braced herself, closing her eyes, preparing for, she knew not what. But then, a large hand, rough and calloused, gripped her arm. Not gently but with a firm, almost clinical grip. He didn't lift her, but rather half-dragged, half-supported her towards the open door. The warmth emanating from within was sudden, overwhelming, a tangible presence that made her shiver all the more violently. He pulled her over the threshold, shutting the door with a soft thud that sealed them within the cabin, away from the biting wilderness, but also, it seemed, away from the known world entirely. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but surprisingly orderly. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs dominated the center. A simple cot lay against one wall, and a stone fireplace, where a fire crackled merrily, radiated a glorious, life-giving heat. The air, thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke, promised safety, even as the man's words echoed in her mind. He released her arm, and she stumbled, catching herself against the table. He moved past her without a word, heading towards the fire. Eliza watched him, every nerve alert. He took a poker and stirred the embers, his back broad and unyielding. The light from the flames illuminated his profile momentarily. A strong jaw, a prominent nose, eyes that remained shadowed, unreadable. He wasn't overtly threatening, Yet his silence, his sheer physical presence, created an aura of contained power. He gestured towards the cot, a curt nod of his head. Clothes. Wet. His voice was still gruff, but there was a practical, almost weary tone to it. He turned to a small chest near the fireplace, pulling out a thick, woolen blanket and a pair of trousers and a shirt, clearly men's, well-worn but clean. He laid them on the cot without looking at her. Dry yourself. Change. He then turned back to the fire, taking a pot from a hook and pouring steaming water into a metal mug. The aroma of coffee, dark and potent, filled the air. He offered it to her, his hand steady. She took it with trembling fingers, her gaze meeting his for the briefest moment. His eyes were the color of slate, neither cruel nor kind, simply watchful. He did not press her. He simply turned away, resuming his quiet tending of the fire. Eliza slowly moved towards the cot, her muscles stiff and protesting. The warmth of the coffee mug seeped into her hands, a small, tangible comfort. She risked another glance at him. He sat down at the table, a book open before him, his back to her, seemingly oblivious to her presence. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. She shed her soaked outer layers, her fingers fumbling with the frozen buttons, her body protesting the cold air that touched her skin. The borrowed clothes were too big, the trousers pooling around her ankles, the shirt hanging loose on her frame, but they were dry, and the wool felt like a blessed embrace. She wrapped herself in the blanket, still shivering, but less violently now. The coffee was bitter but hot, and she drank it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her. He remained at the table, absorbed in his reading. He was not a kidnapper in the way her fears had imagined, not a man who would tie her or threaten her. His earlier words, harsh as they were, now seemed to twist into a strange, dark jest. He had, in a way, kidnapped her from the bitter grip of death, brought her into his isolated world. She watched him, noting the economy of his movements, the quiet intensity with which he regarded his book. He was an enigma, this man Elias, as she would eventually learn his name was. A man who offered rescue with the tongue of a brigand, and provided shelter with the detachment of a mountain. Her fear, though not entirely gone, began to transform, shifting into a deep, pervasive uncertainty. Was she safe? Yes, for now. But what did he want? What did this silent, solitary man expect of her? The cabin was a refuge, but it was also a cage, and she, a bird with clipped wings, had no way of knowing if the door would ever open again. The days blurred into a pattern of quiet, almost ritualistic coexistence. Elias rose before dawn, tending to the fire, preparing a simple breakfast of salted meat and hardtack. He would eat quickly, silently, then don his heavy coat and disappear into the blizzard-whipped landscape, returning only as dusk settled, often laden with firewood or the occasional rabbit caught in a snare. Eliza, still weak but slowly regaining her strength, found herself falling into a routine of her own. She kept the fire burning, swept the cabin's rough floor, and mended the occasional tear in their meager clothing. There were no demands from him, no instructions, no conversation beyond the barest necessities. Water, he'd point to the bucket. Fire, a nod towards the hearth. Food, when he laid out their portions. His eyes, when they met hers, were still unreadable, like stones pulled from a cold riverbed. He never lingered, never offered a comforting word or a curious glance. He seemed almost burdened by her presence, as if her very existence in his solitary world was an imposition, an unwelcome disruption to a long-established peace. Yet, his actions contradicted his distant demeanor. He always ensured there was enough food, enough warmth. One morning, he noticed her shivering, despite the fire, and without a word, added another thick log, making the flames roar higher. Another evening, her cough, dry and raspy, grew worse, and he returned from outside with a handful of dried herbs, brewing a pungent tea that eased her throat. pushing it towards her without explanation or expectation of gratitude. Eliza, confined to the cabin by the relentless storm, spent her hours observing him. She saw the methodical precision in his movements as he cleaned his rifle, the strong, capable lines of his hands as he mended a strap on his pack. She noticed the way his gaze would often drift to the single, worn book he read each evening, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a collection of poems, she discovered one day when he left it open on the table, a curious choice for a man so outwardly severe. She also saw the scars, faint lines on his knuckles, a deeper one near his temple that peeked out from beneath his hair. They told a story of a past she could only guess at, a life lived with more violence or hardship than her own sheltered existence had ever known. Her initial terror of him had almost entirely dissipated, replaced by a complex blend of curiosity and a nascent, fragile sense of safety. The true antagonists now were the elements, the relentless winter that showed no sign of abating, and the gnawing uncertainty of her own future. Where would she go when the snow melted? What was left for her? Silas had left her with nothing but debts and a broken heart. There was no family to return to, no home. The cabin, this isolated speck in the vast, white wilderness, had become her entire world. And Elias, the silent, enigmatic man who had saved her, was her only companion. She no longer felt like a captive, but a guest, albeit an uninvited one, in a strangely ordered sanctuary. She had come to understand that his gruffness wasn't cruelty, but perhaps a deeply ingrained habit of solitude, a man uncomfortable with the delicate intricacies of human connection. He was a man of action, not words, and his actions, despite his initial declaration, had spoken of protection, not harm. One bitter afternoon, as the blizzard raged with renewed fury, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, the distant, unmistakable baying of dogs. Elias, who had been oiling a trap by the fire, froze. His head snapped up, his slate-gray eyes suddenly sharp, focused, no longer distant. Eliza followed his gaze towards the small, paned window, its glass thick with frost. The sound grew louder, closer. Not hunting dogs, she realized, but hounds, perhaps with men following. A different kind of fear, cold and immediate, gripped her. This was not the wilderness, but something human, something potentially far more dangerous than the storm. Elias moved with a quiet urgency that was more alarming than any shout. He blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness, lit only by the flickering firelight. He took his rifle from its rack above the door, checked the chamber, his movements precise and practiced. "Get behind the hearth," he murmured, his voice low, a command, not a request. "Stay low." Eliza didn't hesitate. She scrambled behind the stone chimney, pressing herself against the cold rock, her heart thundering in her chest. From her vantage point, she could see the sliver of the door and Elias, standing beside it, rifle held ready. The baying grew deafening, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on the snow just outside. A rough voice, slurred and angry, cut through the wind. "Elias, we know you're in there. Saw your smoke." A different voice, equally harsh, added, "Heard you got something valuable hiding in there, Elias. Silas Vance's widow. She's got his debts, or something worth their weight." Eliza gasped, her eyes widening in horror. They knew. They knew about Silas, about her. This was why she'd been abandoned, why Silas had always been running. Elias remained silent, a statue of grim resolve. A thud against the door. Then another, louder. They were trying to break it down. Elias raised his rifle, aiming at the door's sturdy frame. The wood groaned under the assault. "Last chance, Elias. Open up or we'll open it for you. And you won't like what we find." Just as the door began to splinter, Elias fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. A grunt of pain from outside, followed by curses and shouts. "He's armed. Damn it." More thuds, less forceful now. Then, a volley of shots ripped through the cabin wall, splinters flying. Elias, without hesitation, pushed Eliza further behind the hearth. shielding her with his own body. He returned fire, methodically, calmly. The sounds of conflict, the shouts, the gunshots, were terrifying. But through it all, Eliza felt a strange calm settle over her. She was not alone. Elias, the man who claimed to kidnap, was fighting for her, protecting her with a ferocity that contradicted his every reserved gesture. The siege lasted for what felt like an eternity. Elias moved with a terrifying grace, reloading, firing, always keeping himself between her and the threat. He took a hit, a glancing blow to his shoulder, but he barely flinched, pressing a hand to the wound, his jaw set. Eliza, watching him, felt her fear transform into something else, a fierce determination. She wasn't helpless. She found a heavy iron poker by the hearth, gripping it tight, ready to strike if anyone breached their sanctuary. But they didn't. The sounds of the men outside grew fainter, their shouts replaced by retreating curses and the fading bay of the hounds. Finally, silence, broken only by the wind and Elias's ragged breathing. He lowered his rifle, his gaze sweeping the damaged cabin. He turned to her, his face grim, a thin line of blood seeping from his shoulder. "Gone," he rasped, his voice strained. He didn't ask if she was all right, didn't offer comfort. He just stated a fact. But in his eyes, Eliza saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, not quite concern, but a deep, shared exhaustion, and perhaps a fleeting acknowledgement of their unlikely partnership. He had taken her in, protected her from the storm, and now from the wolves in human form. He hadn't saved lost girls in the way the stories spoke of, with tender words and gentle hands. He had done it his way, with blunt truth and quiet, brutal efficiency. And in doing so, he had forged something within her, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't a lost girl anymore. She was a survivor. The storm, as if exhausted by its own fury and the violence it had witnessed, finally began to recede the following day. A thin, pale sun broke through the clouds, casting long, stark shadows across the pristine snow. Elias tended to his shoulder wound with practiced hands, stoic as ever. Eliza helped, bringing him water, tearing strips of cloth for bandages. The cabin was scarred, bullet holes marring the rough-hewn logs, but it was intact, a testament to its sturdy construction and Elias's grim defense. Eliza stepped outside, feeling the crisp air on her face, the faint warmth of the sun a welcome caress. The vast expanse of snow stretched before her, blinding white, silent. She was no longer shivering from cold, but from the memory of the past days, the ordeal she had survived. She looked back at the cabin, then at Elias, who stood in the doorway watching her, his silhouette framed against the dim interior. Their eyes met across the snow. There was no need for words. The unspoken agreement, the profound understanding forged in the crucible of shared danger, hung between them like the morning mist. She thought of Silas, of the life she had left behind, a life of fragility and dependence. That Eliza, the girl who had collapsed in the snow, was gone. The woman standing here now, weathered and hardened, was different. She had faced true fear, not just of a man, but of starvation, of the elements, of ruthless men. And she had endured. Elias had not saved her in the conventional sense. He had not swept her away on a white horse. Instead, he had presented her with a harsh reality, a choice: succumb or fight. He had provided the space, the minimal sustenance, and the unwavering defense that allowed her to find her own fight. He had, in his own gruff, unromantic way, awakened the resilience that had lain dormant within her. She walked towards him, the crunch of her boots loud in the quiet. He didn't move, didn't offer a gesture, just watched. "I can mend the walls," she said, her voice steady, stronger than she had ever heard it. "And there are snares to check. I can learn." Elias's gaze remained unreadable for a moment longer. Then, a subtle shift, a barely perceptible softening around his eyes, a flicker of something akin to recognition. He still didn't speak, but he turned, stepping back into the cabin, leaving the door ajar. It wasn't an invitation in words, but in action, an acceptance. He was a man of his own wild, solitary design, and she, Eliza Vance, no longer lost, no longer defined by what she had lost, found herself drawn to the quiet dignity of that truth. She had not found a rescuer in the conventional sense, but a partner in survival. And in the crucible of that harsh, unforgiving land, she had found herself. She stepped back inside the cabin. The world outside, though still vast and perilous, no longer seemed quite so frightening. The cold had taught her endurance, and the silent man had shown her the fierce, indomitable spirit that lay within. Hope, a quiet, resilient ember, began to glow in the heart of the wilderness.